In the days that still live in our stories, millions of buffalo moved across North America. By 1890, the buffalo numbered less than 300.
We still have the songs, we have the ceremonies, but there's no buffalo to be seen. We need to bring that buffalo back.
That is Leroy Littlebear, co-author of the Buffalo Treaty, along with Tasha Hubbard, award-winning filmmaker and creator of the documentary Singing Back the Buffalo, about Indigenous efforts to bring bison back to their traditional territories here on Turtle Island and the powerful impact that is having. I'm really happy to have Tasha Hubbard as our guest on Explore, the Canadian Geographic podcast. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. I'm your host, David McGuffin. We're on a mini keynote species run here on Explore. Last episode was beavers and their outsized benefit to our environment in these days of rising temperatures and wildfires. Give that a listen if you haven't already. There's some fascinating overlap with today's conversation about buffalo. That sound you hear are bellowing male buffaloes recorded during rutting season in Yellowstone National Park. There's a deep resonance to that sound that hits me in the gut and brings me a profound sense of calm. The only thing I compare it to personally is being around elephants on safari in Africa. Similar presence, similar grounding rumble. I've been fascinated by buffalo since I was a child. Family friends in Albert and Prince Edward Island had a petting zoo on their farm featuring 2 buffalo in a wooded pen. As a 9-year-old visiting them in the summer, I remember bringing a chair over to the fence line and just sitting in the shade watching them, being in their presence for hours. Again, something grounding. My next real encounter would be decades later, along the road from Fort Simpson to Fort Liard in the Northwest Territories. Small herds of wood buffalo. As Tasha Hubbard alludes to in this episode, those herds had a reassuring disinterest in all of us. They couldn't have cared less, barely gave us a glance as we pulled the car over to snap pictures. A lesson in humility. Like the beaver, buffalo shaped our continent, numbering in the tens of millions from the Arctic through the prairies and the Rockies into the American Midwest and down into Mexico. By the late 19th century, they were almost completely wiped out by us, part of a deliberate policy to clear the prairies to make room for farmers. Singing Back the Buffalo is an inspiring look at efforts by First Nations on both sides of the Canada-US border to repopulate the landscape with buffalo for their benefit and for ours. You can watch the documentary for free on CBC Gem. It ran recently on the nature of things. A longer version of the documentary is also touring festivals and cinemas around North America. Go to singingbackthebuffalo.com to learn more. Now, let's get to Tasha Hubbard, who I should also add is an associate professor of Native Studies at the University of Alberta and is from Pipikisis First Nation in Treaty 4 territory in southern Saskatchewan. She has a great comeback story to tell about an incredible animal, so let's get to it. Tasha Hubbard, welcome to the Explore podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure, and I really loved and enjoyed your movie, Singing Back the Buffalo, which I was lucky enough to see on a big screen. And if you can see it that way, it's so beautifully shot, so I encourage you. I'd love to find out where the spark of your careers came from when I'm talking to our guests. Like go back to childhood and where did this fascination, I guess even with bison buffalo as well, is that something you can trace back to your childhood?
Oh my goodness, yeah, absolutely. I'm Cree and Nakota on my dad's side and Cree and Soto on my mother's side, but I was adopted out as a baby, and I was adopted by a farming family in southern Saskatchewan, and from the age of 3 to 11, we lived on a mixed farm that had a tiny postage stamp of natural prairie right behind my house. That was my backyard. And I really fell in love with grasslands, with that ecosystem, with all of the sounds and smells and sights.
Can you describe that for people who haven't had the chance to?
Where I grew up, before the land was broken for agriculture, it's very much like a rolling hills of grasslands with buttes, these sort of very large hills that cast these beautiful shadows as the day goes by, small coulees with creeks that run through that have bountiful Saskatoon berries growing. And I can remember my grandpa canoeing us through those and picking with my family. It's a subtle landscape at times, and it's also very dramatic at times.
Yeah.
And it's also, I think, really underappreciated in general, right? People tend to look at grasslands and prairie and often think of it as empty. And that was my childhood, was really just seeing just how full of life it is. And I think it's been so altered that I think that's part of why can't see it in a bigger picture, in that there isn't as much remaining as there needs to be. As I said, it was a tiny postage stamp. It seemed so immense when I was a kid. We would explore it and we would walk every square inch of it. Now I went back as an adult with my son and I'm like, oh, it's so tiny. We're also in the area not too far from Grasslands National Park, which luckily does stand as an example of a larger scale of that landscape. I think, especially in recent times, since the reintroduction of bison, is functioning much more in the way that those grasslands, the way they're meant to function. We're still missing some predators, right? That we don't have the prairie wolves and the prairie grizzlies and things like that anymore. But the bison's really done its work in that space to be that keystone species that it's meant to be. And you can see that in having a much more full range of life that's meant to be there. But I will say, as a child, even what was there was enough for me to just be so fascinated. The other thing that I would do as a child, because I was being raised away from my Indigenous family and nation, is what took the place of that was imagination. And when I would get to some of these larger scale prairie landscapes, an example is the Qu'Appelle Valley, I would imagine buffalo. I would imagine my ancestors and the way in which we moved across the land. And I would feel that. I would feel that in my heart. I would feel that in my spirit. And that just stayed with me my whole time. And by the time I really became fascinated with buffalo, I was 30 years old. But I'd had all this other time seeing them have that agency and freedom to live the life they're meant to live on what is their territory. I think we forget that sometimes. Human beings tend to lay claim to everything and forget that this was the buffalo's territory long before human beings came. And it's been Indigenous territory for longer than we can imagine. And all of these alterations and changes have happened. When you look at it that way, in a deep time sort of sense, it's a little blip, but it's been so dramatic in the scale of destruction and change, right? And I think that's the other element for me that I felt even as a child was grief at that loss.
Sure. If you think about what those herds were like 200 years ago, even, was it millions?
Yeah, millions. And there's debate on what number of millions, and that ranges from 30 million to 100 million.
Wow.
You get to that number, whatever it is, the reality is it's
a dominant feature of the landscape.
It
right?
is a natural one. And when you really stop and think about it, it's mind-blowing that they're not here now in the way that they should be.
So I don't remember much about the film Dances with Wolves, but I do. What is embedded in my head is that buffalo hunt scene, which is just so powerful. And it just makes me, I would love to be in the presence of that kind of life, just and the roar of that sound.
And what's so interesting is I think that image of buffalo hunting is really what has been seen on screen before. What was an interesting moment for me was when we were filming at the 777 Ranch, which is in South Dakota.
Right.
It's one of those spaces where I actually asked buffalo friends of mine, where is the largest herd of buffalo in the most beautiful place? And almost everyone would say 777. We went down there and got permission to film, and they asked, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "I want to see the buffalo move, but I want to see them moving of their own volition." And they said, "Oh, you don't want us to make them run?" I said, "No, I just want to see what they look like when it's their choice to move." So what they did is they let the herd stay as a herd. They don't separate them, which a lot of ranchers do. So what they did is they said, we'll wait to move them to a new pasture, to a new section. And they know, oh, good, we're going to a fresh place. They just opened the gates and gently said, okay, it's time to go. And all those scenes in the film of the bigger herd, that what Helen Carlson says in the film about them being like water, it's because they were moving of their own choice. And it's so beautiful. And the ranch, the woman who owned it at the time, watched me send the crew off on the side by side, and I'm driving the truck, and I'm not really in that, because that's usually what happens. Yeah. There's only room for two, and it's like sound and camera, and director doesn't get to go. And so she actually said, I want to take you into the herd. And she did. She took me into the herd, and we were right in the middle of them. And my camera died. My camera battery died. Yeah. So it was one of those things where not meant to film, just meant to experience.
Exactly.
And she thanked me. And she said, you guys are one of the first crews that haven't shown up and said, please make them run. Yeah. Make them stampede. Because that's the image that we've been given of them through those films. And she said, like, sometimes they're here and it's 30 degrees and they're like, make them run. And they don't run when it's 30 degrees. They're resting, they're keeping cool. I think that's what I wanted in the film was we don't get to see buffalo just living their life in their societies and their communities and their family groups. And I wanted people to experience that.
What was it like being in the middle of that herd?
We were inconsequential. And it was so lovely. We were just, there's an object, gonna go this way instead. And they just were going about their business. And a few of them would stop and give us a little look and then keep going. It was really powerful for that reason of just, they don't need us. Yeah. They don't need us. If they can live the way they're supposed to live, and that's the ethic around our relationship to them as Indigenous people, we needed them. And we had agreements that are in our stories that we had to honor them, and then they would give themselves, and then we were dependent. And it's a built-in humility that we had that is very much missing today in general society, I would say.
Yeah, no, and your description of being in that herd and not mattering, that's the best of nature right there, isn't it? Yeah. Like you realize where you stand in the bigger picture. God, what a gift.
It really was.
At the center of this movie is a herd that was introduced into Banff National Park in 2017. There's a group of women, various aspects of buffalo interest and studies and research who go looking for them and go on a walk. And why did you choose that herd? And just tell us a bit about that moment.
Yeah, so I started to be more, I've been working with buffalo and stories as my academic work since 2003, but 2010 things changed in that I met the late Narcissus Blood and started to think about how I could be more active in supporting buffalo, and then met Leroy Little Bear and others. I met Mary-Eve Marchand, who was living in Banff, and she had started a nonprofit called Bison Belong. Its intent was to make clear through communication, through other strategies, that buffalo belong not just in Banff, but in Banff, but that buffalo belong on these landscapes. And did a lot of work to connect parks, connect Indigenous people. And so we were all excited about buffalo coming back to that landscape. The American Bison Society held their meeting in Banff in 2016, and we held the Buffalo Treaty Gathering that was its third ever, the second gathering since the original signing. And we had a great group of people, and the decision was made. We need to welcome these buffalo back to this territory and do that through ceremony. And so we just all felt a sense of connection to these 16 animals that were coming from Elk Island. A lot of times transfers are their trucks. They're trucked from one part to the other. This was different. They'd have to be flown in, given the remoteness of where they were going to be. I think we just all felt a sense of connection and how, I don't know, lucky these ones are that they get to go and be somewhere where they're living their free life without a ton of human intervention. And so in 2019, Mary Ave organized a group of Indigenous women, Cree and Blackfoot, to go in to visit and go do a backcountry hike. And I was invited that time, but I had a previous commitment actually to go to New Zealand, and that's with another film project. And so I went again, and I went in 2020, and it was later in the summer. And so they were higher. The hotter it gets, the higher they go. Mm-hmm. And it was my first time backcountry hiking, learning how to do that, learning a lot, and also learning the level of physical ability that's needed. And I thought I had it, and then you're out there and you're like, oh God, no, I don't. Should have been training a long time ago. And as a result, there were some other factors, but when it came time to make that last climb to see them, I couldn't do it. And there were a few of us that couldn't do it. 4 women were able to make that last climb. One of my good friends is Glenda Abbott, and I gave her my tobacco, and I'm like, please give this to them because I can't come. And she was so lovely. She's like, I'll pull you up. And I'm like, I know if I do that, I won't have enough gas to get back down, because we had to go all the way back down, right? You know, I just felt like this is such a special time that those of us who've been able to do that have, to connect with the buffalo first and foremost, but also to really know ourselves, know our full selves, our emotional and physical and mental and spiritual selves on that trip. And I just was like, I really want to include this in the film. Yeah. And, you know, and it was a bit of a research trip of like, how are we actually going to pull that off with no power and no all those things. But so when we did film it in 2022, you know, we had all those lessons, and we also went earlier, and you kind of find that right spot where it's not exactly in calving season, so you're not disturbing them. They're also not up in that high alpine yet, that they're still in the lower. We really found that right time, but we also had learned that they did respond to our songs in that first trip. Yeah. And we sang that song when we left, and what the staff told the first trip, and the songs that the women have, and the park staff told us that, and actually we had to decide, do we stay and have 2 shorter days to get out, or do we stay and have 1 long day? And we decided on the 2 shorter days. Just, you never know weather. But they told us that if we'd have stayed, they came down to us where we were.
Oh, wow.
And we thought about that when we went this next time. We thought we'll start singing sooner so that they know we're here. They know we're coming. Yeah. And that's,
what are these songs?
They're ceremony songs. Yeah, they're ceremony songs, which is why we can't record them. Mm. The songs in the film were all ones that were able to be recorded, that we had permission, that there were protocols and processes. But some things are just not accessible to a public audience. We still wanted to talk about it because we didn't know that they were with us the entire time. We didn't know that they had come to meet us. We didn't know. We were thinking we were going to them, that we had 2 or 3 days and that moment in the film where we surprised them and they surprised us.
Yeah.
We had seen a bear earlier, and we thought that's what it was. When someone said, hey, we thought it was a bear. So we're yelling, bear, because you got to scare them. And so we just scared the heck out of them, because here we like we're yelling and making ourselves big because we think it's a bear. And then finally it's the herd. And we're like, oh no. And so you can see it on our faces. We're watching them run and we're like, oh, we were the worst guests. Like, sorry. Did we
that
just
it,
scare
right?
them off and that's it?
Yeah.
We're going to be out here another 6 days, 7 days, and we're not going to see them. But they didn't go that far.
Yeah.
And they're forgiving. And we were much better guests the next time we encountered them, which is the moment in the film where you see us quietly laying on the ridge, which they fully knew we were there, but we were trying to show them we're not a threat.
Yeah, because I think you talk at one point, you're like, it's 1,200 square kilometers, this park. I mean, it's like needle in a haystack territory, right?
And the park staff told us, like, people go out there for 10 days or whatever to see them, and they come back and they're like, no, we didn't signs, but you don't actually see them. So they were amazed. The park staff were, when we told them, we saw them every day.
Yeah.
And I think that's what made them check the two, because they knew where we were, and then the buffalo have trackers as well. So that's why they were able to superimpose the two, and you could see how they came to us and were with us as we moved through the land.
It's amazing. So that herd started as what, I think 16, right?
16, yeah. They're still there. I don't know how many are there now, but I think they were 80 when we went the first time, and I think they were like 100 and some. So they're probably, I haven't asked, but they're growing at a rate that they're meant to, and buffalo reproduce faster than, people tend to compare them to cattle all the time, and it's so frustrating because they're so different, but they have their freedom and agency out there. And there's an Indigenous advisory, which is wonderful. And they've recently started working on Indigenous hunts to come in and take one or two. And so those have started. And it's, I think it's such a, I guess I've been doing this, and there's lots of people who've been doing this much longer than me, but I've been doing this long enough to see the changes that are happening in policies and in the ways in which places like parks are, how they're working with Indigenous people. And I can remember going to the Grasslands, and I was there when they brought Indigenous people to come and see them in 2010, and they brought elders to come and see the sacred sites. And that hadn't been done before. And then how things wax and wane, and then change of government, there's less money, those things aren't happening. And I think what's been great, though, to see in the last little while is just an opening and an awareness of that special relationship that we have as Indigenous peoples, and that historically parks have been sites of exclusion of Indigenous people. And we're seeing the shift back to, it's actually, these are our territories that we have stories about, that we went through, we moved through, we have relationships with, and the buffalo are a part of that.
You mentioned Leroy Little Bear and the Buffalo Treaty, and I'm just wondering if you can tell people a little bit about who he is, what that treaty is doing.
Yeah, so Leroy's a member of Ghana, or the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta, and a longtime Indigenous scholar and thinker, and who has multitudes of interests of law and science and ecology. And so he was the supervisor of Paulette Fox, who's also from the same nation. And it was her academic work around buffalo that led to the creation of these buffalo dialogues. The Blackfoot held these dialogues throughout the Confederacy. So they have 4 nations as part of the Blackfoot, 4 Blackfoot nations as part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So 3 on the Canadian side and 1 on the American side. So they started holding talks where anybody could come, and they would have community people and elders and youth and leadership and storytellers, and having these dialogues. And what came out of them was the elders saying, we need to commit to bringing buffalo back. We're ready as a people, and we can't do it alone. We need to work with our brothers and sisters from other nations, because we all have that relationship with buffalo. And so the decision was made to have a treaty. And we had treaties amongst ourselves for millennia, right? This was not new with the numbered treaties. We had a process of making treaty with each other that we thought, the thought was, let's do that again. And the treaty was Leroy was the main author, and of course in consultation with everyone. And so the first treaty gathering was held in the Blackfeet Nation in the US, where 8 nations signed the treaty. So the 4 Blackfoot and 4 others. And then very quickly, other nations started wanting to sign. And essentially, it's a commitment to, and people think it's, we have to have buffalo in order to be a part of the treaty. And it's a commitment to reconnecting and repairing our relationship with buffalo. And there's lots of reasons why that was fragmented. So here we are in this time. Helen says it so beautifully. And I heard the same phrase from different people from different nations that I visited over the time of making the project, was that buffalo supported us for so long. They helped us for so long. And now it's our turn to help them, right? Because the conditions that exist are beyond their control. And so we as human beings, we as Indigenous people, can start to break down those barriers and bring them back so that our youth, our children, grow up with buffalo again. Because there's lots of people who have never even eaten buffalo, have never spent time with a herd, have never sang the songs. That's the legacies of residential school and other policies. So the Buffalo Treaty is a step in that healing for ourselves and our communities. I think we're up to almost 80. The number changes, but we have a lot of nation signatories. These are nations in Canada and in the US. And then we have probably thousands of supporting signatures at this point. And so people can sign as an individual to say, I want to support the return of buffalo. I want to support buffalo consciousness. It's been a beautiful decade, I think. And so we just had the 10th anniversary gathering in September of 2024. Oh, wow.
Amazing. It's bringing the buffalo back to First Nations lands and that kind of thing as well. There's also a genetic aspect to it too, which I hadn't even thought about. But I guess we were down to 300 buffalo at one point.
Yeah.
So it's a small pool.
And because of the restrictions on movement, which that's something that was my work and still is my work, like thinking about the ways that our fate is intertwined with the buffalo's fate, and that we live through policies where our movement has been constrained by government policy, right? We lived through the pass and permit system, and I have my own family stories of how that negatively impacted our ability to thrive. Right. And the buffalo are in the same boat, right? There's very few herds that have some freedom of movement, and they're the only big ungulate that is restricted in that way. We don't restrict moose, we don't restrict elk. They're allowed to live the way they want, but buffalo is very different. They're very regulated. And so that's had an impact on genetic health, which they have their own systems of figuring that out, of how to avoid interbreeding. So part of that has had to be these moving of buffalo around. We were, through the Buffalo Treaty and our nonprofit, which is the International Buffalo Relations Institute, we recently facilitated, in partnership with Fort Peck and Mosquito Grizzly Bears Head First Nation in Saskatchewan, the transfer of 11 Yellowstone bison across the border.
Oh, wow.
And so the long-term plan is that these, hopefully to continue that transfer, and these are buffalo that are part of the parks policy and partnership with the Intertribal Buffalo Council and Fort Peck, the 3 partners, to have buffalo that leave the park boundary. If they enter into a quarantine zone, they can then be moved to Fort Peck and be tested over a period of time to make sure they're disease-free, they're not carrying brucellosis. We also had to do a test for tuberculosis. And so they're the most tested buffalo, And we had to work with both USDA and Canadian Food Inspection Agency, financial partners and border staff to do this historic transfer, because they've never been allowed. The ones that are direct from Yellowstone have never been allowed to cross the border because of perception. Even then, buffalo have never given brucellosis to cattle. It's actually elk that are the brucellosis spreaders who aren't regulated. But that tells us, like, what is it about buffalo? And that's where my work comes in, is buffalo and Indigenous people have been conflated since the days of settlement, and we were both seen as obstacles to the settlement of the West, right? And some of that stuff still lingers. And so our perceptions and misconceptions of both us and buffalo remain and are some of the challenges that we're trying to overcome.
Yeah, I was interested too in the documentary. The Native American experience of bringing buffalo back has been easier?
I think it's gotten easier recently. I think that the challenges were really always there. As we know, our communities have a lot on their plate, that they're dealing with a lot of those legacies I mentioned earlier. There are communities that have community needs the same as any town or city, so there's that element as well. It's been a challenge for nations to bring buffalo back because there isn't always the support financially and otherwise for that. That's what's been changing. There's been more of a support for them to come back, both within the community and within government and other agencies. And the leadership that are bringing buffalo back are doing so. There's possibilities for tourism. There's possibilities for livelihood. Those are elements. But there's also the element of how they help us. Having those buffalo near us help us. They help us heal. And I've heard so many stories of people that are struggling with their mental health or struggling with addiction and go and sit with the herd for 2 hours and they help. Yeah. This is the bigger vision of we want to bring them back and give them more space to live because we want to help them, but they also, we know that they help us. But the key is really being aware and breaking down some of these barriers to say, okay, we need to actually think of their long-term health. So there's gifts and exchanges that are happening on an Indigenous level of, oh, we've got some animals with different genetics, let's trade, let's send a bull, we're going to gift you this, because we know we want to make sure that they're there for the long term. Yeah. The other thing we're thinking about, though, is our nations are really small in Canada through the way that...
Physical territory of the reservation.
Yeah, so, some of the stories in the film, the Americans, for example, like with the Wool Lakota project in Rosebud, they have 28,000 contiguous acres for the buffalo. That's bigger than some of our entire nations, right? So we're starting to think, like, where is there space out there on public lands, on these bigger, I had the postage stamp backyard prairie, and then there's the grassland. There's places that are in between that could sustain larger herds.
So like Crown Lands.
Crown Lands.
And where's the movement there?
There's movement. We just had an initial summit a few months ago to bring together different people to form relationships. I think what's really amazing with buffalo is there's Indigenous peoples, there's NGOs, there's bison ranchers, there's a lot of interested parties that love this animal. There's been a lot of movement in the US of bringing those partners together. There was just last week the North American Bison Summit that brought together all of these different partners. And I was supposed to be there, but I was in New Zealand, asked them to bring another Indigenous woman down instead of me. So we're doing the same. We're starting to have those conversations here in Canada to figure out how we can do that. Part of that is perception. And this is where the film comes in. And this is where these stories of buffalo come in, is to try and correct some of those misconceptions, to also have people understand how beautiful and deep that relationship is that we have, but also the good that buffalo do to the land. They are the renewers, literally. And when you think about their range, they shaped North America. They sustained the entire continent, and we need them again. We're seeing our soil health deteriorate. We're seeing our air quality. We're seeing all of these things shifting and changing. The buffalo do heavy lifting
Tell us about that.
With our climate.
What impact have you seen?
They're doing studies now on how buffalo, they're seeing the change in the health of certain vegetation, of certain endangered grasses and plants and medicines that need the buffalo to come back. And it's the same with endangered species. When we think about biodiversity, why is it certain species are struggling? Absolutely, it's habitat. We've been encroaching on their habitat. It's also the loss of things like the keystone species of the buffalo that some of the most well-known endangered species directly benefit from buffalo in a way they don't benefit from cattle. So there's countless examples. And if people are more interested in learning about that, I would recommend Wes Olson's beautiful book, Ecological Buffalo, that goes through and explains just what an enormous impact buffalo have to the land.
I was surprised about how in the movie you point out they create wetlands, which I never would have thought of. But basically them rolling on their backs.
And they also don't disturb existing riparian spaces in the way that cattle do. I've watched them. They take turns. They come to a body of water. They take turns. They don't just all rush in and trample around and make things muddy. They're so polite. It's lovely. They come in and they drink and then splash around, cool off, and it's the next turn.
Yeah.
People have that misconception. In the places we do have existing grassland left, which we need to protect at all costs, having them on the land strengthens that whole ecosystem, and it strengthens the roots of the grasslands. And that's where the carbon capture happens, right?
Right.
That's the heavy lifting that grasslands does. And the two of them are symbiotic, right? The land and buffalo. I think when we're thinking about buffalo restoration, as a Cree woman, I'm thinking about what it's meant to my son to grow up with a relationship with buffalo and how it helped him. And I want that for other children. But I think just as a human being living in this land, it's like, I'm thinking, where are we in the future and how important buffalo are to having that sustainable future.
Yeah.
And that's my hope for the film, is to start people on that path of realizing we're missing something very key. Indigenous audiences, I expected that part of it is they feel some grief because it names that feeling that I had as a little kid and didn't know why I felt that. It helps people come to terms with that. But I've also had a lot of non-Indigenous audience members also feel that grief. And it's, yes, because we all live here. If you're benefiting from that destruction too, it's okay, then what can we do to give back? And what can we do to right a wrong? It's a historic injustice. And so how do we, and part of that is just protecting grasslands, not tilling it under, putting resources and support into policies that support buffalo restoration. These are all things people can do.
I just actually did another interview about another keystone species, the beaver, with another U of A professor, Glynis Hood. Yeah. So one thing she got into was just the biodiversity that comes from the repopulation of beavers. They went in expecting to find handfuls of different species, and they wound up finding dozens and dozens of new species returning back, and just the health of that land. And
it's the same with buffalo. I mean, parks have been well positioned because they've had the Elk Island grassland, but grasslands in particular, because Elk Island's now had them for a long time, over a century. But grasslands, they didn't get reintroduced until, I think they arrived 2005 and then were put out on the land on 2006. So the possibility for baseline studies to see, okay, what was here before they came and then what's happened since. And some of the staff there have shared with me, like, exactly that. Species of plants that they thought weren't in the park didn't appear until buffalo came. Because they need something specific that the buffalo brings. And in Banff, it's the same thing. I've talked to one of their researchers, and they've been mapping the area with infrared to see the different growths of different plants and vegetation. And it's changing and shaping and bringing things back. But Wes's book really lays that out, where it's so many. I think he had a hard time deciding which ones was he going to talk about because there's so many.
Yeah, it's incredible. So do we know in Canada, I guess, or in North America, what the numbers would be nowadays?
I'm not sure. The general, there's about 500,000 remaining. The majority of those are ranched. And the ranchers, there's a spectrum. Those that sort of like 777 that try to let them have their natural state of life and have the land to do it, and smaller scale where that's maybe less possible. And then there's buffalo that are living in designated conservation spaces and tribal lands, etc. But I think there's always that sort of, it's a Euro-Western thing of like, how many and counting. And I think for us, we're less, it's just not enough yet. So let's not worry too much. But, I think there's benefit to having a sense of numbers. But I think the main thing is that we're doing this in collaboration with their habitat, that we're bringing them into spaces where they can renew land that is unhealthy. I'm really interested in what their role could be in reclaiming agricultural land that's been over farmed and the soil's very unhealthy. Is there a possibility for them to help renew that? But there's some great work that's being done. Melissa Arcand, who's in the film, is a good example. A growing group of people that are working on determining that. And as Indigenous people, we kind of giggle amongst ourselves. There's things that we'll know that then science is, hey, there's this. And we're like, yeah, we know. And buffalo is renewal. That's baked into who we are. We know that. Yeah. We know they're the renewers. And so the science is coming along to show.
That's come up in this podcast before. Indigenous knowledge is science.
Oh, yeah. It is. We silo everything in a Western, Euro-Western mindset. And things are much more interconnected. My background is in humanities, but my work is really also about science. It's also about story. It's also about that interconnectivity that I think that I take my cues from teachers like Narcissus and Leroy and my adopted dad, Sid Fiddler, and others where I've learned our knowledge is interconnected in our stories. This false siloing is a detriment. We need to start thinking with that interconnectivity again.
So what gives you hope?
Buffalo and how quickly they recover from hard situations. I'll give you an example. One of the transfers I witnessed was the Elk Island buffalo down to Blackfeet. And Elk Island is quite treed, right? There are these open meadows. The buffalo live in the trees for the most part. And so when they got transferred down to Elk Island, the calves stayed in this row of trees that was along a fence line. And the caretaker was like, how come they're not out in the open prairie? Like, they've got all this prairie and they should be so happy. And I'm like, but they're still kids and they're a little bit scared. And so they're in what they feel comfortable with. I had to go home, but I said, please let me know when they leave the trees and go out onto the open prairie. Yeah. And he called me in 3 weeks. And he said, they're out on the open prairie now. And I said, because they recover faster than we do as human beings. They dig deep into who they are, their ancestral memory, and they're like, we're buffalo. This is our time to be out on the prairie. And they remember who they are. And that's what we're doing as Indigenous people. And the buffalo have been our teachers, and they're our teachers in that as well. And that's what gives me hope.
Amazing. And last question, which I ask everyone who comes on, is can you describe a favorite place in this country? And the Cypress
Hills. I love the Cypress Hills. I go every year to this place that's just on the east side of the Cypress Hills before.
So this is Grasslands is down
Grasslands is a little further east. That whole ecosystem of southern Saskatchewan, like deep south Saskatchewan, northern Montana, there's so many places in that space that I feel that spirit. I see buffalo so clearly. It's got so much depth and beauty, and it's where I feel myself, my best self.
Tasha Hubbard, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
And thanks to all of you for listening. Check out Singing Back the Buffalo on CBC Gem, or even better, go to singingbackthebuffalo.com and find out where you can catch it on a big screen. As well as being beautifully told, it's a stunning movie to watch. A book Tasha mentioned is The Ecological Buffalo by Wes Olson. Its foreword is by Harvey Locke, who is a guest on episode 25 of this podcast. It's a fascinating conversation on biodiversity and his Yellowstone to Yukon conservation initiative. And remember, Canada's best magazine is Canadian Geographic. It has the biggest paid circulation of any magazine in Canada, and for a very good reason. Award-winning writing, award-winning photography, and maps. And a subscription is just $28.50. That's what many streamers charge just for a month these days. Instead, you get 6 print issues delivered to you and unlimited digital access for an entire year. Also, what better way to show your national pride than helping Canadian Geographic tell Canada's story? Remember to rate and review us where you listen. It helps feed the algorithm gods and helps people find us. Until next time, when we'll explore again. I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people.
We left Simpson about June the 10th with the fur brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
And we flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 160 dives or so. There are shrimp, fish swimming around outside. It's just fabulous here.
Well, I'm a first for Canada.